Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights, here with Val Marz. We're going to talk about all things NASCAR and mainly cards for NASCAR, although there's a very thriving hobby that includes more than just cards. It's just great to go to the races and the total NASCAR experience, but mainly cards. Thanks sponsors, Topps Panini, Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Huggins Scott Auctions, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, ComC.com, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentications. Thank you, Val. We've been on Hobby Hotline together, and we've done an episode on a tribute to the 20th anniversary of the melancholy date of Dale Earnhardt's passing in Daytona. But welcome back. This will be a more positive episode talking about NASCAR. It's not my first love, but it is a love. Is it your first love? And welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Dr. Beckett, for having me. It was not my first love. NASCAR is one of those sports where I was like everybody else. I collected all of the other sports and moved over to NASCAR. My family moved to the Charlotte area in '86, dibbled and dabbled like that. But then when Charlotte got the NASCAR Hall of Fame, I figured it made sense for me to dive into it. I started collecting in the late 2000s, but with the Hall of Fame coming, it's living in Cooperstown and not collecting baseball. So I'm going all in.
Do you think Charlotte is the epicenter of NASCAR?
Actually, no.
Francis?
Daytona is really where NASCAR started, the France family and all that. But Charlotte, because of where the races were situated in the South, even before NASCAR, actually, a lot of races. And so they put the race teams, a lot of them here north of Charlotte, Kannapolis and Mooresville. Right. Probably the majority of all the teams are located there. There's a few outside of Charlotte, but not many. So it only made sense to have the All-Star race here and then the Coke 600 in the fall race. Atlanta was in the bidding, Kansas City, I think, and maybe Daytona, but Charlotte was awarded the Hall of Fame.
Charlotte had two races early on. I thought when most of the place only had one race a year.
No, most of them were twice. Like Daytona, they run in the first race and actually the 500, then the July 4th race. And now it's moved. Darlington had two. And during the late 90s, they pulled tracks away other than like Rockingham. They lost one, and then they put in Texas and California and Las Vegas and other stuff. It started to be more regional, more diverse in the United States, different tracks, California, Phoenix, right. All that. They've actually run to Mexico and I think Japan once, twice, whatever. But so Charlotte got the Hall of Fame, and it kind of made sense. I knew the legends would be coming here, and as someone who gets autographs and stuff, I thought it'd just be the perfect sport. And like I said, I collected the other sports, and there are so many different things to collect in NASCAR. Like with the other sports, we have die-casts, but uniforms and sheet metal and all that other stuff. I tried just to stick to cards because I don't have the room to do all this other stuff. So I took my love of baseball, hockey cards, stuff like that, and then transitioned over to NASCAR. I just thought it was, like I said, the perfect opportunity. They were so undervalued. I think it's the second most watched sports behind football. For
total attendance, yeah.
Yeah, and it just made sense. And my dollar could go a lot farther collecting. And at the end of the day, it's about collecting and building sets and getting autographs and that kind of stuff.
Okay, but around here, if I go to a card show, and probably even at the National, there's less than 5% of the stuff that's NASCAR. What would that percentage be like in Charlotte, in the hotbeds? If there's a card show in Charlotte, is it 10 or 15% NASCAR, or is it? Surely it's more than what we see in Dallas, which is just barely blip.
It's probably like that. It's probably about 10, 15%. Well, it makes going to the National, I can do the show twice during the week, and it makes for a quick conversation with some of the dealers. Ask them if they have NASCAR. Most of the time it's no, and then go on to the next table or whatever. And when you find something, you can do a deep dive or whatever. But in the South, it's probably about the same. Like I said, like you were saying, about 10, 20%. We just had a show here in Hickory not too long ago, and there was some NASCAR. And because of the craze for cards now, there's a lot of stuff coming out of the woodwork. Some of the older stuff, everybody sees these prices, and I think they just kind of throw some high numbers on it and see what they can get for it.
But by older, do you mean 88?
Yes, exactly. You hit the nail right on the head. The early stuff is all you have is the 1970, 1972, 1983, and then 85 and 86, and then you're into the 88 Max and all the way up. So so vintage, that's the other thing too about collecting old NASCAR. I spent those years looking for 1972 STPs and some of that old stuff. And I have to give you guys credit because I learned about some of that stuff in your magazine, because you published a racing price guide. I think it was one of the articles you guys did a Hall of Fame, and I think it was Dane Turner and some of the other pioneers, and then some of the original sets. And that's where I found out some of the stuff and then just dug into it. So there's not a lot of stuff to collect, not like baseball where you can go back to the turn of the century.
And we're saying NASCAR, but are you into Indy at all, or Formula One, or any of these others? Most of the people that I know, when I would hit the shows in the Southeast, it was almost all NASCAR.
I don't see a lot of Indy or F1. I'm not a big collector of that. Now I do, I guess, dabble in a little bit of stuff. There is a really cool, some games from the late 70s that had cards in it, and they have some NASCAR drivers in it and Indy drivers. So there's some of that overlap. I hardly see any Indy or F1 cards out there, but I did go to, I think it was an Indy 500. They have a memorabilia show there, and took the trip one year and went looking for NASCAR stuff. And that was pretty cool. We found some signed tickets and NASCAR stuff.
In NASCAR, I don't think there's unanimous support for the GOAT, for the all-time greatest. Do people, according to their age, line up with a certain GOAT in their own opinion? In NASCAR, because there's some very dominant drivers that had long, strong runs. But what do you see there? Because it's obviously superstar driven in the sense that you got to win consistently. And when people have good runs like that, Jimmy Johnson or Richard Petty or Dale Earnhardt, Sr. especially, Jeff Gordon even, what is your take on the GOAT in respect to NASCAR?
Yeah, I think depending on how old you are is which GOAT you're backing. Each one of them did amazing things in their time. Richard Petty he raced everywhere. It wasn't just one race a week like they do now. They're racing multiple times a week, and there might be two races on the same day. And with Dale Earnhardt Sr., he was more the everyday blue collar guy and just tough as nails, and just through maybe not being the best driver, but he's going to win no matter what. And then with Jimmy Johnson, he just had the perfect setup with him and Chad Knaus, his crew chief. And NASCAR was changing the rules, and they were still winning. When Dale Earnhardt Sr. and Richard Petty were driving, they were under the same rules, but with Jimmy Johnson, they were changing the rules, adding the playoff system that we have now that wasn't available back then. So I guess the case could be made for all three.
Okay, but there's, for the non-GOATs, a couple things. One is that I'm wondering if there's such a thing as a common driver. When we were doing price guides, you would have the drivers that had a really big following, but it seemed a shame that when they're out there defying death, you would call them a common driver or a common car. And then it might be, as you mentioned with Jimmy Johnson, in really all these situations, if it's a common driver, maybe it's a spectacular driver and their crew or their owner, or they're underfunded in some way that they're disadvantaged. So that's different from these other sports. In baseball, you go up and you get your own batting average. But in NASCAR, you're driving a car that somebody else set up.
No, you're exactly right. The only thing I can think of is maybe playing for a smaller team, maybe like the Dale Murphys, who have never won the World Series or stuff like that it's fantastic player, but you can look at his individual stats. And NASCAR, you don't have necessarily that because of maybe running for a smaller team or moving around different teams. You can be the greatest driver, but you still need the crew and the equipment and the setup and stuff. So it's more of a team sport, I think, than people give it credit for. So yeah, I can see exactly what you're saying about you have maybe some of these lower level teams where the odds are against them. It's going to be probably 4 or 5 different teams. One of those members is going to win. But then again, you have smaller teams that can pull off the big upset, like Michael McDowell running for Front Row Motorsports, I believe, and they did the impossible. And then Chris Buescher comes to mind a few years ago. So it happens, but
it just seemed to me there were, back when I was doing pricing involved, at least in the company in the 90s, late 80s, 90s, there were drivers who were in all the sets and they never won. Okay. And so, but they're showing up every week. But like I said, whatever the setup was, they weren't winning, but they weren't getting fired. They were doing the best they could. And like I said, people were crashing, and they have consummate skill. That's the only sport you can say that. They're showing up, but they didn't win for long stretches, if at all.
Yeah. Some of that I guess you'd have to look at the race results. So some of those teams, they look at how fast the car is, and if they can finish better than what the car is set up for. And so that's considered, I don't say a win for them, but that they did better than they were supposed to. And those smaller teams, also saving the car is a big deal, because those smaller funded teams, they can't afford to replace the cars. And some of the bigger teams, they will have multiple cars, one for short track, one for super speedways, one for set up this way for the high banks, just all kinds of different stuff. And the smaller teams, they're hoping just to bring the car back in one piece, and they'll set it up. Yeah, that's a big thing too. If you destroy the car too many times, then you'll be out. That's
worse than hitting into a double play or throwing an interception. Yes. Speaking of other sports, I'm a fan of Joe Gibbs, the person, but I wasn't a fan of Joe Gibbs, the coach of the Washington football team, because I was a Cowboy fan in those days. But he's done very well in NASCAR. And is that an attention to detail? Was that his first love? How did that happen that he went from winning Super Bowls to being a dominant figure in the NASCAR world?
He's in the NASCAR Hall of Fame. I think he's the only one that I know of that's in 2 Hall of Fames. I think he just has a knack for personalities and putting the right people in the right spots. That was, I don't know if you know that story, not how that started, but his son didn't want to get into football, but he approached his dad about starting a race team. So they got Dale Jarrett, and they didn't have a sponsor, but they talked to Interstate Batteries, and Interstate Batteries was on board. And they didn't have a crew chief, and they didn't have a place. They didn't have anything, but they just started building it, and they won the championships. And now they have one of the biggest teams or best teams. He's right up there with Hendrick. There's a pecking order like you have in baseball, your Yankees and the Red Sox. Joe Gibbs, he's a Yankees. He's a Boston Red Sox. With the stable of drivers he's got, rookies coming up, and the championships they've won, I think it's the way he treats people, but he's built up an amazing team.
You know, I'm familiar with Interstate Battery because it's located here, and I know some of the people. Again, they're pictured in the cards when there's a picture of the car, but it must be a great two-way street for the sponsors. The drivers get the publicity in one sense. They're driving the car, but the logos are plastered all over it. And I think it's been very good for Interstate Battery.
Yeah, the whole sponsorship, there's a primary sponsor and then some secondaries and stuff. And I think sponsorship can run in the millions, anywhere 10 to 20 millions, depending on the level. When I worked for Lance, we were a minor sponsor of some cars, or we chose a few races to race. But I think they also entitled, like Marcus Ambrose came to the home office and he signed and we met him. So they get the advertising on race day. And of course, if you're one of these big high teams, you get TV spots, and then Victory Lane that there. But then there's also the drivers come and do publicity, like Joey Logano and stuff comes to mind. He does Planet Fitness, and Brad Keselowski does Discount Tire. So that's one of the things, like when the races come to town, this is pre-COVID, you can get autographs for free, and Joey Logano will be at a Planet Fitness opening one, and like Brad Keselowski will be at Discount Tire, or stuff here. Martin Truex will be at the Bass Pro Shop, and Austin Dillon and Richard Childress will be there as well because they're big hunters and stuff. I guess it's that two-way street. They get the advertisement and they get attached to, I guess, a winner.
I think that's a precursor of what's going to happen in these other sports. I think you're going to see baseball players, football, basketball, with more and more prominent sponsor recognition on their uniforms. But I love the interaction that NASCAR has with fans. I think it's exemplary that the drivers are available through the sponsors. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks, Val. Give NASCAR consideration. You ought to check it out and check out NASCAR Radio, which is Val's popular podcast. We'll be back again tomorrow with another episode.
The man in the house of cards.